Peter Frankopan, welcome to Hard Talk.
Hi.
You are a professor of global history, so I want you to bring your historian's eye onto the longer-term impacts of this coronavirus pandemic. We hear from the scientists, from the politicians. Give me your historian's perspective.
Well, it's a fairly predictable thing a historian would say, but change and widespread disease are nothing new. Our ancestors all lived through big pandemics, some of them which were much more lethal than coronavirus. And one of the products of living together and in high-density populations, going back as far as historical records go, is you find that there are transitions of disease from animals to human beings, and they inflict damage. And that damage typically you measure in mortality rates, but then the economic and social consequences of disease. There's a lot of examples from history to learn from. But the challenge with coronavirus is that it's not as lethal as we all thought it would be. So primarily, we're looking at the economic and social dislocation that comes as a result. But global history and the history of long-term big periods, big regions, climate and disease are two of the big ticket items that join continental histories together.
But given our knowledge of past pandemics, whether it be a long time ago with something like the Black Death, or whether it be more recently with the Spanish flu of the earlier 20th century, is it surprising to you just how much economic disruption and dislocation has been caused by this particular pandemic, which, as you've just said, in terms of cost in life, is a relatively mild pandemic?
Well, that's partly because the health services globally have managed that quite well. But to give some sort of scale, if COVID had killed at the same scale that Spanish flu did, relative to the same population-wise, we'd be looking at 230 million deaths now, rather than just over 1 million. And even the economic contractions, I mean, in the US in the Great Depression, the scale of GDP loss was 10% every year for 4 years. So by the mid-1930s, the US was 40% smaller than it had been going into the Wall Street crash and what happened afterwards. So even now, a dip down of 4 or 5% of the US economy is huge. But I think it's important to have some perspective that societies, cultures, periods are not immune from this kind of widespread disease. In fact, even in the 1950s and late 60s, there were two pandemics that killed more than COVID has done. And the big question is, how do political decisions get layered on top of what the medical and healthcare consequences are?
So in that sense, would it be right to see this as some sort of a test of different political systems, different styles of political leadership? And if we do see it as a test, who's passing, who's failing?
Well, the sort of knee-jerk reaction answer to that is that China has passed, having messed it all up to start with, and now we're doing a good job of messing it all up in Europe and in the United States. The truth is that there are lots of other countries that have done quite well, and they're not necessarily technocratic, authoritarian and closed societies. Places like Taiwan and Japan and South Korea have done really pretty well, partly because they had exposure to the SARS virus in 2003 and understood that pandemics were something that were likely to come up again, and therefore contact tracing, medical provision, there needed to be preparation. And I think here we were immune because it wasn't something that we lived through our past history. We talked about the Black Death at school, but otherwise no one had really mentioned the Spanish flu for decades in classrooms and lecture rooms until the beginning of this year. So I think when you edit out and select the bits of the historical narrative that are more interesting to you, then you forget that disease, and like I said, climate is another big issue that is constantly moving and changing and has these long-term consequences.
But is there something about authoritarianism, about the strength of central authority and its imposition upon its peoples, that has, in a sense, shown its strength in dealing with this pandemic? And I'm not just thinking of authoritarian systems like the Chinese system, but I'm also thinking of the degree to which some democracies have adopted more intrusive and, quote-unquote, less democratic practices as a result of trying to deal with the pandemic.
Well, your geographical position in the world matters. If you're geographically peripheral, like Scandinavia or New Zealand, then you have a different dose, you have a different level of connectivity with the rest of the world. If you're a country like the UK, which is the centre of all global flight routes, then the incidence of people coming backwards and forwards in and out of your country, you're going to spread and catch much quicker. So I think one has to factor in, before one starts to ask about political decision-making and whether authoritarian systems are better at doing it, the scorecard is very mixed, and there have been some democratic systems that have been extremely resilient and robust and anticipating it, and some that have got it wrong. And likewise, I think it's very easy to think that countries that have single state control respond well because their scorecard is extremely bad in lots of other ways in terms of identifying and dealing with problems, change and so on. Because the good thing about democracy is it allows you to work out what you've done wrong, and there's accountability.
Well, you're now introducing thought